we go. Welcome to the monthly Truck Stop webinar brought to you by the Motor Carrier Insurance Education Foundation. These truck stops are presented the second Thursday of each month at 11:30 a.m. Eastern Time. These webinars are presented as industry updates for information purposes only and do not qualify for state CE credits. If you're seeking state CE credits, we have many opportunities for that. Just go on our website, MCIEF.org, and we'll give you the list of the CE programs that the foundation provides. If you have any questions, type them in the chat window. We will answer them and respond to them after the webinar by email. If you're experiencing any audio problems, please send us a note in the chat window or call our number 800-741-484. We'll attempt to correct the problems as soon as possible. PSP, Pre-Employment Screening Program versus MVR, Motor Vehicle Records. Today we have with us Justin Reed. Justin, welcome. We're glad to have you with us today. Your camera didn't work, but we got your picture up. Tell us a little bit about yourself and HighRight, and I hope you're doing well today.
Absolutely, Tommy. Thank you for having me on today. Yes, the camera was being a bit shy. I suppose it didn't want to show up today, so you'll get to see the picture. I found the best one I could for you. Appreciate the opportunity. So my name is Justin Reed. I am the manager of Transportation Solutions for HighRight. I have been here with HighRight in the background screening industry for the last 21 years. I do work from my home office in Lincoln, Nebraska. HighRight is one of the largest providers of background information for our FMCSA or DOT environment, impacting some over 10,000 customers in the space here today. So we're very well entrenched in the environment and glad to be able to talk to the subjects here today, Tommy. Thank you.
For some of the old timers who haven't connected or not, this used to be DAC, and they started this many years ago when FMCSA first required pre-employment information. And so DAC went in and captured all the information and started selling it. So, and as you know, Justin, I have a long history, maybe even before you got with DAC, HighRight back with them. I've been in their Tulsa office before and those things. So we really appreciate this, and I appreciate all that HighRight has done and DAC has done before that for the foundation and my programs. Let's talk a little about this. Pre-employment screening program, commonly called PSP. I've said often that a driver lives in a glass house, because as they run down the highway and go through weigh stations and get stopped and get inspected, all that information from inspections can be used for underwriting, can be used in claims against the motor carrier, as available for new potential employers about the potential new drivers. When a trucker gets stopped, there's two databases. There's a carrier SMS, safety management system, where you get the CSA scores that we look at all the time and go through those as we look at a risk to look right and their availability to underwrite them, or at least the markets that will underwrite them. There's also running one in the background, the driver's SMS system. The driver SMS system is where we get this PSP information. So most everything you see in CSA is also then available or charged back to the driver. So let's look at more depth on this, Justin. Tell us a bit about how this works.
Tommy, thank you. So PSP, Pre-Employment Screening Program, fairly simple, although most people really don't know what PSP means. It has become just its own thing in the industry. In essence, though, when you look at PSP, it is a repository of information that has been contained in a singular location, and that is in this PSP database. So it's quite convenient from that standpoint that this data is being collected in one spot for easy access. Now, what data is really coming out when you look at the PSP report? You're seeing a 3-year look back on roadside inspections. Now, this is really interesting because this is giving us a snapshot into, as that driver is operating that commercial motor vehicle, what types of things are they being called out on with regard to these roadside inspections? And are they issues that are pertinent to the driver's behavior in terms of pre-trip inspection and what they're willing to drive the vehicle in what condition and so forth. And then also, we're looking at a 5-year look back on crash data. Now, this is pure crash data. We're not talking about conviction information. This is simple crash information, and that separates it quite differently from the other subjects we'll talk about here on this particular podcast here today. Go ahead.
And it's in that database in Plano, Texas, right? The MCIEF database.
One never really knows where the database truly lives, Tommy. So, but yes, it's really supported by a company called NIC Technology, NIC. And NIC is, years ago, they were selected by the federal government to be the vendor and maintainer of this information. They've done a great job and, continue to keep that in a very good, their operational success with PSP, and I'm going to mention this again later in the conversation, but their operational success is something to be envied from a standpoint of available database access. This system hardly ever goes down, at least from what we're seeing here.
I went back in FMCA because I didn't remember when this started. I knew it started in May, and this has been with us for a while, 2010. It was a purpose to improve the safety, the highway safety. PSP provides truckers and bus companies secure instant access to commercial driver safety history records for pre-employment screening purpose. Again, PSP goes 5 years of inspections for crashes and 3 years of inspection. PSP is a system that makes safety performance information electronically available for pre-employment screening purposes for drivers of commercial motor vehicles. FMCSA believes that making drivers data available to potential employers and drivers will improve the quality of safety data and help employers make more informed decisions with hiring commercial drivers. Justin, I think this is what's happened in these 12 years it's been in process. It really has made the motor carrier more information to decide who to put behind the wheel. And I think you'll have found that successful, have you not?
Well, it's been tremendously interesting to watch this from the beginning, Tommy, because back in 2010, 2009, 2008, when the CSA 2010 initiative was being ramped up, if you recall back then, I did quite a bit of traveling at that time, speaking for state trucking associations on the impact that was coming from the CSA 2010 initiative, and this is part of that. So PSP, in my assessment from a screening and recruiting standpoint, has grown from something that maybe nobody really understood what it was going to be to really an integral part of the recruiting fabric that's going on throughout the entire industry right now.
I thought it was interesting that in this website, they had a little data here that I don't know if you've even looked at, but I'm sure you can verify this through your relationship with your customers, DAS customers. But according to a study released by FMCSA in 2013, PSP positively impacts the safety of American roadways. In the study, I saw that the entity that really helps the most, and this is one that we need to focus on to get involved in this, is someone over 5 units, and maybe before they get 20 or 25 units. And I always said when I teach this, Justin, once we quit hiring family members and neighbors, then we start recruiting out in the public, we don't have enough staff to screen those. Once we get 25 or 30 drivers, then a lot of those bigger companies have ability to do some background. So this is where it showed is really effective to get some kind of, as you mean, an instant review of what this driver had done previously. I think this is where the sweet spot in it, at least from the production of this part of it. But I thought this was interesting. The study showed that carriers using PSPs have an average decreased crash rate of 8% and drivers out of service rate for 17%. That's a pretty significant improvement just by looking at being more careful of the driver you put behind the wheel, right?
When you look at it from a standpoint of it being a singular report, and you can attest that we've got an impact on safety with regard to crash data, yes, 8% is substantial when you consider how simple this is to deploy as part of your recruiting program. I think the 17% out of service rate has got to be paid attention to from a standpoint of impacting the bottom line of a carrier. Clearly being out of service not only has some impacts on CSA scores and so forth, but it's impacting the bottom line and what your shippers are willing to trust you with. So clearly there's an influence here that comes at really a shallow cost and a fairly simple effort.
So more data, the better. So this estimate showed about 12 months that they reduced about 863 crashes. And again, 3,500 drivers now didn't have to wait to be inspected an hour and a half, 2 hours. And once they're put out of service, now it's going to have to even more delay of that part of it. So this is really significant. And the more sophisticated motor carriers understood this early on. And I think more and more are buying into it. I hear from listening to our insurers and to insurers who have this process that they put more attention on this than later we're going to be talking about MVRs. This actually shows, does a driver know how to drive a commercial motor vehicle and live with all the federal FMCSA regs and rules? And that's an important part of that motor carrier's operation.
Yes, especially when you consider looking at the roadside inspections component of that. MVRs, as we'll talk about here, certainly have an important part in the recruiting environment. But that out of service or that roadside inspection environment this is probably one of the most comprehensive ways to consider that in a very quick manner.
So we look at what the federal website has. So give us some of your practical experience these next couple of slides here, Justin. Go ahead and walk through these for us, if you would.
Well, I think one of the most crucial things to understand is PSP is not codified as a regulated piece of information. You don't have to do this. It's optional. It's not going to give any compliance benefit to your driver qualification file or any of the 391 regulations. So it is purely a tool to be used for pre-employment screening, as the name attests to. And in that, keep in mind that what we're really looking for is driver data. We're going to search by license number, name, alias, and so forth. It is you can get a large swath of information here based upon the license number. And there are many ways to obtain the PSP report, Tommy. I think this is important to understand that certainly you can have connection to PSP by going directly to NIC Technologies, or, it's kind of guided through the federal website to do that. But you can set that up and use it as a standalone. And when you talked earlier about some of the smaller carriers or smaller entities out there that have, they've hired all their nephews and nieces, and now they're ready to actually start hiring outside the family. Well, this is a good way to get started in that environment because it's a quick and rather inexpensive way to get a good piece of information. That being said, third-party integrations are very prevalent. Certainly, HireRight has had a connection with this database so that our customers can receive it as part of whatever screening protocol they want to run their driver candidates through, and others as well. So NIC does a great job with their technology, with keeping those integrations functional, and really top-notch, top industry performance in that regard.
So it becomes a single source of data for the critical driver elements. So you can combine this with other things. And I know you all do it with when you pull an MVR, you also pull a PSP. I assume you can pull the criminal background check and anything else the insurer needs from one simple application process, which a lot of vendors like yourself does that. In fact, one other member of our foundation, Carrier Software, who does a lot of stuff underwriting, is a provider of this because they got customers. They provide this too. I don't think they provide MVR for PSP, but this makes it really easy for a motor carrier, does it not, to get everything they need or think they want to need to look at a driver up front?
Certainly from a standpoint of how are you going to recruit with the information that you need for compliance and decision making. They're not always exactly the same thing. PSP not being a mandated report is part of that decision making environment, whereas an MVR also part of decision making, but also checking the box for compliance. So when you're building your recruiting program, the more sophisticated or larger you get, or certainly the more pressure you have on your time, generally what you'll start to do is bundle things together so that you can get those reports more quickly. However, when you start to look at the number of candidates that might be coming into your recruiting portal, you've got to start looking at time and how quickly can you make a decision as to whether that candidate is worthy of moving forward to the next step. And during that decision, you want to be sure not to spend any more money than you need to, certainly because you don't want to run necessarily a full gambit of reports on somebody who would be easily disqualified on a less expensive screen. And I think that's really where PSP sits in a very important spot. Why don't you go to the next page here, Tommy?
Let me stop here for a minute and ask you a question about this. I like this fixed pricing. And one thing we'll talk about later with MVRs, MVRs vary greatly based on how much the government's charging you, the state's charging you to access that. But PSP is a very simple report, and that would be a way to qualify a driver. Do we want to spend more money on them as we then do the drug testing and the rest of this kind of stuff? I've never really put those two things together. But do you have motor carriers with that attitude, or at least they use this as the first steps to decide if we're going to move forward or not?
You know, really the big question here that we need to unpack in this conversation is, do you use a PSP as your first screen, or do you use an MVR as your first screen? And there's a valid commentary on both subjects. The PSP isn't a required screen. So if you spend your money to run the PSP, you still, if you like that driver, have to move on to compliance pieces. Now, that being the case, the MVR has variable pricing. You run an MVR in the state of Nebraska, you're going to pay, something like $8 maybe to the state for that information. Plus, on top of that, you're going to pay your vendor for the access rights. If you go to the state of Oklahoma, they're going to charge you, I think it's $26 or $28 now just for the information plus your vendor fee. So the wide variance.
And we didn't even mention Pennsylvania.
You know, and I'll get to that here in a moment because there's other complexities there. But when you just look at the cost variance alone, you realize that, you know, a PSP report is a fixed value. It's the same price whether you are ordering 1 or 100. And it's also a single source of data. So from a standpoint of variability in access, it's more stable. Certainly with MVRs, you've got 50 states. That's 50 different access portals that your vendor will manage, but that's 50 relationships, and each one of them is in a different state of capacity on any given day.
I'm not sure we have this later because I know we break down some state stuff, but I'll just, as you mentioned this, the charge that High Right puts on top of the state charge is minimal. Back when I looked at it, you only get what, $1 or $2 or $3 for handling an MVR. The rest of it goes to the state. So those costs is not something the vendor like High Right's providing or getting. It's what they have to pay the state for that information, and that's what varies, where the fixed cost of PSP is a little different than that. You want to look at this next slide, Ben. So I talk about accessibility.
Well, yeah, I think that the accessibility piece is in multi-factors. As I mentioned earlier, you can connect to PSP with really minimum effort And if you are a smaller carrier with limited human resource available to you, this is one of those things that can become a very quick qualifier for your candidate. If you're a larger organization, certainly the integrated capacity of your technology vendors, such as HireRight, make that a very simple report to obtain and quickly review. Now, keep this in mind, PSP reports are, for the most part, an instant retrieval. So you submit the information to request the report, the information runs through the database filter, and you get it back to you. That means you're able to make decisions about whether or not you want to proceed with that candidate right now. In the MVR space, there are really two types of MVRs that certainly HireRight has available in terms of delivery status. There's the standard delivery, which means we get information back from the state. Generally, within 24 hours, you'll get that report returned to you. Or we can do it in an express capacity, in which case we can deliver it back to you in about 90 seconds. That has some considerations to what each state has allowed us to do. Their technology will support. Most states are at a spot now where they will give us an express report, but there certainly are some that won't or don't. So
I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but you all still have the ability for the ones archived where the driver has went more than once, and you pull the MVR for a previous employer, potential employer. Now you can give it to a second one without the state fees. Do y'all still do that?
You know, there's, depending upon the state and so forth, there's some capacity in that regard still. Certainly in our SIDLess system, we have a solution called SIDLess Plus that allows us to review that candidate's SIDLess record, and if we have information on CDL MVRs that have been pulled within a recent time frame, yes, we have the capacity to send that along to the carrier. What we're finding, though, Tommy, is the complexity of the MVR space with regard to states choosing to create barriers to access to their data. I mean, one of the things to keep in mind, just about every state in the union at this point is trying to find ways to make money. And
No joke.
That the data they have is valuable, and especially if it's data that you must obtain in order to qualify your driver, they kind of got you right where they want you. So when I started in this industry, over 2 decades ago, most state fees were less than $5. I think that at that point, the most expensive state fee was a $6 bill, and people thought that was outrageous. Well, now you're pushing on the door of a $30 bill for some states. So they realize they've got that info, you got to pay for it, and they're getting their due out of that.
That's one thing you can say about the federal government. Maybe they're a better buy than dealing with the states when we're talking about state rights. But, Justin, this drives us, the insurance industry, up a wall, because we'd love to see this stuff when we look at drivers. We look at the MVRs and they look decent, this part of it. But this is something that we have to emphasize when we talk about our retail agents talking to the insurers and encouraging. In a minute, we're talking about encouraging the insurer to get a part of the program. But it's only available to the motor carrier for the purpose of conducting pre-employment screening, and only with the driver's written permission. So I've even understood that if the owner of the company is not involved in employment, they really can't see this. So it's kind of protected for one purpose and one purpose only, and that's so someone who wants to offer that person a job can look at their roadside inspection to determine to offer them a job or not, correct?
What the regulation or rule around this, Tommy, is really trying to accomplish is maintaining a connection directly between the candidate and the recruiting process, and allowing the recruiting to insurance process to be managed by the company and the insurer, but they aren't willing to allow essentially that line to get blurred where the insurer is looking directly at the candidate with this particular information, because the information that's being presented in PSP specific to crash details does not indicate a conviction or an indication of guilt with regard to whether or not that crash was the fault of the driver. It is going to provide you with information regarding the was it a tow-away situation?
Yeah,
was there a fatality?
Extreme reportable driver. Yeah, I emphasize that when we look at these drivers, as we look at safer and those things, that doesn't mean any indication that whether they're negligent or not, who was at fault or not, that part of it. So how we do use it though, because we can't use it for insurance consideration, but we can on an application ask, are you using PSP? And most of the motor carriers insurance companies who specialize in insuring for hire and state motor carriers ask that question. Then the fleets are large enough, and sometimes these small fleets are not visited by loss prevention people, but then when the loss prevention people come and visit, Justin, they'll see if they're using PSP and how they're using it. And that's pretty permissible to do it that way, to verify as a part of underwriting. This is a part of our driver selection process. Then we can verify, are they using this information properly by looking at those files? Because it's not involved in employment now, it's involved in, are you living up to what you told us, kind of a thing. So this is the only way we involved in it. I did hear one insurance companies that were starting to demand a copy of PSP, but Justin, I think that's against the law, is it not?
I wouldn't feel comfortable utilizing that information for any sort of underwriting position. Certainly I could understand the requirement or the encouragement that PSP be utilized in a macro sense within the organization that you're going to underwrite, because it represents a commitment to a safety culture that is, certainly something you want. But if you start getting into hey, I need to see this guy's PSP, provided to me as an underwriter secondhand,
or before I'm willing to insure it.
Yeah, we're stepping right outside of Fair Credit Reporting Act rules in that regard, because consent from the driver was between the driver and the recruiting entity, not the driver and the insurer, the insuring entity.
And this is the one point that we're going to emphasize later, the MVR part, is that part of the Fair Credit Reporting Act requires this written permission. And so again, no agent, nobody else can do this. This is a regulation set by the government, and that form is pretty standard, is it not, Justin? And you are having to be very careful with those forms to make sure they are in compliance.
Tommy, you're correct.
Retail agents need to discuss this with their insurers, particularly smaller ones, why they need to consider using PSP in their new driver screening. And when an insurer uses PSP, they need to incorporate this into the hiring standards. This is something that retail agents fail to get, because now I've got something else that's going to be part of my looking at a driver. Will I hire him or her, and how I might discipline them later? Now, one thing that we also need for the people that are with us who are not realizing the whole story today, some of them might not, depending on their relative experience. And the reason it's for pre-hire is that once that driver is driving a vehicle with our insurance DOT number on the side, we can find out who that driver's name is and their activities with the motor carrier's PIN number. So we don't have to have it for current drivers, because we're able to easily monitor those through our own portal that shows our own inspections with our own DOT trucks, meaning our own being the motor carrier. So it's only for the ones that look at the prehistory, not I'm going to keep them here. But this gets back to employee practice liability, Justin. I don't know how deep you get into making sure they're on board and meet all the ECC rules and those things, but from a court case, it's also important to talk about how you're going to use the PSP as a part of hiring and discipline. And then these are your standards, and you need to follow and publish those standards without getting in trouble, I would think.
Well, certainly from HireRight's perspective, we're going to provide the information at the request of the recruiting, customer of ours, and how they deploy that through their system is going to be up to them. But certainly within regard to, the recruiting decision, Tommy, is if you're going to order this report, then a critical component, and this is something that certainly your underwriters would be relevant for them to discuss with their insureds, is, okay, you are using PSP. Do you have any protocol around the information that you obtain with regard to how you're going to make decisions with that information? And I think this is something that we really can't underscore heavily enough. Information without consistent utilization of the same practices with that information are a disaster waiting for that hiring entity. So if I run a PSP on you, Tommy, and consider you for employment and say no thanks, and then you run a PSP on me and consider me for employment and say sure, but you had no idea why you did that based upon the data that was before you, you've got yourself a problem.
Right. This is a part of here. So when we look at this, I just put this out of, we don't want to read these details that involved in this part of it in detail, but I just put this out again out of the federal website definition that motor carrier here includes the agent, officers, and representatives concerned with the installation, inspection, and maintenance of a motor vehicle and or accessories. The applicant, this would be the applicant who's applying for a new job, other than the employer who is seeking employment there. And then the employee is anyone who drives our insurance DOT number side. This word employee becomes a problem when we deal with owner-operators and independent contractors. And I want to circle back around to remind people who are not aware of it. The federal definition of employees for oversight purposes and for responsibility of who's driving that truck and what damage that person driving that truck might do and who's going to be responsible for paying that damage. The federal government says that employees, anyone who drives a truck, including independent contractor, owner operators with your insurance DOT number on the side. So we can use this for not only a true employee, but also for anybody who's driving our truck. And that goes back to the federal definition of employee. I assume there's nothing on this that you think needs to be explained in more than detail, but I thought it was important to sort out who these players in this process are.
Certainly, and I think I want to close out one comment that needs to be said with regard to PSP. Keep in mind, this is still a consumer report from a standpoint of FCRA. If you run a PSP on a candidate and then choose not to hire that candidate because what you saw on that PSP was not going to meet your standard, then that does qualify as an event that would trigger a pre-adverse and adverse action process, so that you're notifying that candidate that you are making a decision in full or in part based upon this consumer report. And then of course that gives that candidate the right to, request that information and review it and so forth.
Right, that's the important part here. The next thing here, we did part about here is employment, but I've seen this, and you can tell me if you're comfortable or not on this thing, that for a new venture, one of the concerns for a new venture is to them how to drive and what was on road here. And since as a part of underwriting, if the driver, the owner of that company, who is the owner operator with one truck, brings you the PSP, now it's no longer, and voluntarily gives it to prove that of the driving history, then it's not involved in employment. I've seen it used this way, and Justin, I just want to know your thoughts or comments about using it that way, where we want to write you your new venture, but who did you used to work for? What was your history with that person you worked for? And can you prove that to us, just so we will consider you with this kind of history? And one way to prove that is, again, showing us your past driving, who you were driving for, and the PSP shows that. Would you think that would be a violation of the Fair Credit Reporting Act if that owner of that company voluntarily provides information to prove their history?
Tommy, I feel like this is a very slippery slope. I would be uncomfortable endorsing that idea, simply because anything that I get involved in, I like to ensure that first and foremost, the FCRA is held up as the gold standard for the way that we're going to engage candidates. whether they're an owner operator trying to lease on or somebody coming out of a large pool of candidates, to say to them, bring your report to me, brings them outside of the protection of the FCRA, which I think are relevant and valid rules for the protection of our citizens here in the U.S.
Yeah, I agree that's part of it, and there's a driver privacy and all that. I'm just, I think this is where the new ventures are so hard to write, Justin. Most companies are afraid of them. They want to know a little bit more about them. At least here's some way to do it. This is the fees that can be when you talk direct. I just threw these in. If you're a motor carrier with more than 100 power units, then it's a $100 fee. And then I think it's a $10 fee above that, but less than that is $25. And what they charge $10 for every time you pull one. And then you incorporate it without that setup fee when they pull an MVR, right? And just add a slight surcharge above the $10.
Yeah, and just pricing wise from Higher Right's perspective, the initiation fee is something that is when you come through our integrated portal, that doesn't apply. So that's, it's $100 that you get to save, and you gain the convenience of a fully integrated ordering platform that works with all your other required screens.
And again, the driver can access their own, and in one sense they should too, because they need to data queue that when they get stopped for FMCSA. Often there's the inspection reports are wrong, and we encourage the motor carrier to data queue any mistakes. But the driver should be aware of this too, particularly if they see something on the roadside that later the motor carrier data queues. It doesn't mean that their record is going to be expunged. So they need to look at that part of it. And again, the 5 years and crashing the 3 roadside. So the driver can sign up to receive a notification through the monitoring every time his or her PSP record is updated. Is that a prudent thing that the driver should be aware of and help them keep track of this?
Well, the professional driver certainly needs to understand that the career path that they're on requires more than just driving skills. They're going to have to engage in their career development, which means their record and how they're being viewed in the industry through these official channels. So yes, from a standpoint of being on top of what these records are containing about your history and making the request for correction when there is indeed a relevant correction to be made, that's on the driver. And as a professional driver, that's what you're going to have to do to manage your career.
I've heard enforcement officers talk about it. That one thing PSP shows that a driver tends to not completely divulge. I didn't say lie. Don't want to do that. About 28% of the time is who they previously worked for, where PSP shows this. This is a real big thing at one point. This is actually where DAC High Right started, was looking at all the information. What else can you look on? Does a PSP show that's kind of unique? You can relate it to what we look at for SMS reports or the CSA information. Just an overview. What do you see other than who they used to work for?
Well, you will receive information with regard to the crashes. You're going to get a count on those crashes on that period of look back. In that, you're going to determine, is it preventable or non-preventable? So you'll get a quick bird's eye view of that information. You're going to see, are we looking at injuries? Are we looking at towaways? Are we looking at fatalities? Basically, the 3 triggering events that you would have for a DOT recordable accident there. And also, if there's a hazmat category, so if you happen to be involved in a hazmat crash, that also can be triggered as a quick look. When you do have a crash,
Go ahead, Justin.
Just when you do have a crash that is determined to be non-preventable, that is actually highlighted in the report so that, at the quick glance, the recruiter will be able to see, oh, this was, a non-preventable scenario, so they can, weigh that however they're going to in their process.
That's when the motor carrier challenge it. Does the driver have to also challenge it? Does it automatically change their record with the motor carrier's record?
Good. Tommy, I'm going to have to say that one I'd have to verify before I would give you the full answer on how that gets changed.
Because the preventable and non-preventable usually takes what, a couple,
Yes.
months or so before that's determined.
Yes, it's certainly not a quick process. Generally, that's if you've got a fresh accident on there, it's likely not yet been fully determined.
And it shows FMCA's violations. One of the examples that our friend Rob Mosley used here is that a motor carrier says we do not hire anybody who had a drug violation and gets on the stand, has a crash, and the driver and the motor carrier is asked, if you knew that person had a drug violation, would you have hired him? No. If you wouldn't have hired him, they wouldn't have killed these people. What would it cost you to find out if he had a drug violation? Because he consumed alcohol 4 hours before he started work, which is a drug violation, and it cost you $10 to figure that out. If you had, you wouldn't have hired him, and therefore you would not have, then they would not call the crash. That's the kind of stuff that can end up binding us in court later, too, also, Justin, in this area. Those are PSP. Go ahead.
Absolutely. Well, I think the other thing to keep in mind is the inspection details are really quite robust and interesting as well. So when you're looking at the inspection details that are provided on PSP, it's a good snapshot into the driver's general approach to their own personal safety and how they're developing their career as a professional driver. You're going to be able to see, are these things that were part of a general pre-trip inspection that the driver really was responsible for determining whether they would proceed with driving, or are these things that were really maintenance related that were outside of the driver's ability to either impact or even know about. But nonetheless, that information is fairly well developed on the PSP report, fairly easy for you to quickly determine that.
Now we move to MVRs. What is an MVR, Justin?
Well, of course, the motor vehicle record with regard to the commercial driver's license is essentially the complete driving record within a specific issuing state. Now, there is a lot of information available on a driving record, and therefore, keeping this in mind, I think that certainly the listeners here today will understand that there are employment MVRs and then there are underwriting MVRs. They do have slight differences, but they are important to recognize that the employment MVR in general provides a deeper swath of information to look at. This is all controlled by the state, and the duration of data also generally controlled by the state. You're going to have your minimum amount of data required under the 391 regulation, so you've got to have at least a 3-year look back. Some states will give you just that. Some will give you up to 7 years. Some states say, hey, if you want to see back as far as we've ever known this person, it's open to unlimited screening. 10 years is generally like the limit that we're going to see. But it is interesting that it's all across the board.
And then the states control this, and it's a violation of state driving rules, not FMCA driving rules. Had an example the other day where the officer was on the Road Dog radio show talking about, well, he gave someone a warning so it would show up as MVR without realizing it would show up as PSP because it was on his report. So there could be some differences like that as we evolved in it. It's unique data. Do you help them decode this? When we teach, we talk about that MVR decoder there, but every state has a different code for things. Reckless driving could be drunk, or it could be just speeding too fast. Do you give us some suggestions about how to read these MVRs by various states?
Well, I think you're right on, Tommy. It's complicated. Every state sort of built their own system, and the codes that they use to describe the hundreds of different offenses that could be put onto that MVR, they're all unique to that state. So certainly over the years, HireRight has done a fantastic job of creating a tool that decodes all of that and puts it into a common language. So when you buy MVRs out of HireRight, you'll be able to receive not only the information from the state, but it will be decoded in a manner that's consistent for each violation for you to be able to review from state to state. Delivery time, again, we kind of talked about that earlier, and we already covered costs. But let's get down to required for compliance. You mentioned Pennsylvania earlier, and Pennsylvania is kind of the tip of the spear for with regard to carriers' ability to access information and how that information is going to leave the state through what particular conduit will they allow. So Pennsylvania, in essence, has said, we're happy to provide information to a third-party vendor such as HireRight for your purpose of employment, pre-employment screening. Okay, but we're not going to allow that information to move past that initial vendor into any other third party, such as any sort of DQ management system or electronic file repository or whatever it might be. So Pennsylvania has put specific restrictions on that, which aren't necessarily consistent with what the industry wants in regard to moving that data around. But keep in mind, each of these restrictions that get put out there are really done so out of the concept that one or two things is happening for that state. They're either trying to protect the candidate and the candidate's privacy, or they're trying to protect the data from a standpoint of data security and ensuring that there's not going to be this long tail of information out there that they don't know where it is at. So,
or they might be wanting collecting more money, but I won't bring that up, okay?
Well, and the other part of that, though, is what we're seeing is these are expanding. So there are now multiple states who have determined that they're going to have their own specific rules about you're going to collect that MVR information. Pennsylvania is just a good and easy one to explain, and they get more convoluted from there. But 10 years ago, there were no states doing this. Now we've got going on to, well, an easy half a dozen and probably more like 10 states now that are enacting very specific rules about how their data will be used.
You provided this PSP or MVR. Walk through this for us, because I think it's a good chart on each side that will tell us.
Well, yeah, you already kind of got onto this earlier where the MVR is considered for underwriting. And I think that's absolutely correct. It's a key component of that decision is, can you insure that driver based upon the driving record, the convictions that are on the driving record, and so forth, where PSP is giving us this crucial data. But as a motor carrier, are you prepared to interpret this data? Do you have any sort of concept when you see that there were, so-and-so inspection, roadside inspection details there? What does that mean to you? How are you going to apply that against your recruiting decision? Certainly MVRs are required for compliance. That's 391 compliance, so that they'll be in the DQ file once that candidate is hired. And then, stack that on top of the MVR underwriting. Variable pricing for MVRs, fixed pricing for PSP. Fast delivery for PSP, variable delivery for MVR. Although I will say most MVRs are pretty fast. Now, let me put a caveat onto this about MVR delivery. So, for instance, HireRight has direct technical connection for MVR delivery from all 50 states. That's 50 different technology connections that we manage. Literally, we get audit requests, we get various different things that we have to comply with 50 different types of states. It's hard to do this. But that direct connection means that things like the Pennsylvania experience that I just explained aren't a barrier to getting that information. It also means that we are maintaining compliance across that full spectrum. I think that's important. PSP, one database, one connection. So you can imagine every single day out of 50 states, I've got at least one state that's got a technology glitch making it difficult for me to get that information.
Like the camera today.
Like that stupid camera, exactly. So every single day there's something that pops up and you think, gosh, that wasn't a problem just a few minutes ago, but now it is. PSP, as I mentioned earlier, is an extremely stable environment, hardly ever goes down. So there's some value in understanding the complexity of that from a standpoint of what are you doing to make your hiring decisions or to at least move the candidates along from either the bucket of absolutely not to looks like a good opportunity.
Now, I had this question asked me last week when we did, or a couple weeks ago with Mary Carey's. Why can't we send MVRs to our insurers? Why can't we order them and give them to them? You want
Well,
to,
it comes down to
talk about this off and tell them about this. Go ahead. Tell them why.
Well, yeah, it's permissible purpose, right? So when the recruiting entity, the trucking company is gaining consent from that driver to run a motor vehicle record, they're gaining consent to run that motor vehicle record for the purpose of consideration for employment. Consequently, they are given access to the full record, which is an employment purposed record, and that is what they've given consent for. If then they turn around and use an MVR that was delivered for the purpose of underwriting, well, that's a separate purpose. That's not the same intent of the original consent that was given. And subsequently, it falls right out of the FCRA. I mean, you just don't have compliance at that point. So the other part of it is MVRs that are obtained for the purpose of underwriting are not quite as robust as those that are obtained for employment. So the hiring company isn't really getting what they need to comply with that fair credit, well, really with the 391 elements of pre-employment screening using an MVR for the purpose of putting it in the DQ once you hire someone.
Anyway, they can't do it. Let them do their own. Wind this up.
There's a long answer for you, Tommy, for a short statement. You're very precise. They can't do it.
Yeah, Justin, we appreciate your time today. Very briefly, the MVR reflects the driver violation of state driving rules. PSP represents the driver violation of FMCIEF regulations, which is one that we, in ensuring 400 state motor carriers, actually pay more attention to, because MVRs could be the personal vehicles we worry about when they're driving that 18-wheeler. That's the concern we have here. And so I think this gives us an insight that everybody needs looking at this balance. And I hope the attendees here will walk away knowing more about it, but also encouraging the insurers to use it and give us some guidance to how to best use it. Thank you for your time today, Justin. Really appreciate it. And we'll look forward to seeing you down the line, my friend.
My pleasure, Tommy. Truly, thank you so much.